Alright guys, here we are with 6-4 fractions, decimals, and percents. There's just one vocab word this time, which is percents. Percents is comparing something in relationship to 100 as a ratio. So if you're talking about 74%, that means 74 out of 100. So we're always comparing to 100, and it's a ratio for percent. What we're talking about here is really going back and forth between fractions, percents, and decimals. So the first example shows us to go from a percent to a fraction. So they have 45%, and we're talking about comparing to 100. So what you're saying here is that you have 45 of 100. So we can write it like that. Remember that ratios look and act just like fractions, which means we can reduce this. So I can tell pretty easily we can divide by 5 here, so we're going to try that and see if we have reduced it the whole way. I think our greatest common factor here is 1, so that means we have, oh, I divided wrong. Alright, this should be 20. Still, our greatest common factor is 1. So we have reduced that correctly, and the fraction that represents 45% is 9/20. The next one they give us is 120%. So again, even though that's over 100, we are comparing to 100. We can reduce this by dividing by 20. We get this. And we can change this into a mixed number, which is 1 1/5. So 120% would be the same as 1 1/5. Next one we have is 0.5%. So again, we're comparing that to 100. Excuse me. It's not really proper to have a decimal in your fraction. So we are going to multiply each of these by 10, which would move our decimals one place. We get 5 over 1,000. We can divide each of those by 5, and we would get 1/200th for our reduced fraction there. Our next example, example 2, is taking fractions to percents. So in this case, because percents are comparing things to 100, we want to change our denominator to be 100. So we're going to think about what do we need to multiply this by to get to 100, which would be 20. So we're also going to multiply our numerator by 20, and we get 80, which means 4/5 is the same as 80%. The next one is 9/4. So again, we are going to want to change that denominator to be 100. This time we need to multiply by 25. So 25 times 9 would be 225. So 9/5 equals 225%. And yes, it is okay to have a percentage over 100. The next section, we are going to take our percents and change them into decimals. So this time we have 28%. What you do when you change a percent to a decimal is you're going to move your decimal 2 places to the left, the same as dividing by 100. So you could think of this as a relationship between 28 and 100, but what this is telling you is to take 28 divided by 100, which means you're going to take the decimal, which if there isn't one, it's to the right of the number, and you're going to move it to the left 2 spots. So now it's going to be here, which is 28/100. The next example is 8%. Careful when you have just one digit in your percent. The common mistake would be to say that this is 8/10. But really, if we're moving that decimal 2 places, we're going to need a placeholder 0, and it's going to be there. So we have 8 hundredths. Same thing if you have a percentage over 100, make sure you're only moving that decimal 2 places. So here we would have 3 75 hundredths. Next set of examples, example 4, they are changing decimals to percents. So this, you're going to move your decimal 2 places to the right. So if we had 35 hundredths, we're going to move that decimal 2 places to the right, which means this would equal 35%. Next, we have 9 hundredths. Again, be careful, you're moving that decimal 2 places. So this is going to be 9%. And then if we have one that's over 100%, again, remember you're moving that decimal 2 places to the right. So we would get 7/10%. Next up is example 5. This one, they are changing fractions to percents. So if we have 7/8 and we need to figure out what percent that is, you're going to do this just like you would if you had a quiz and you were trying to figure out what grade you got on the quiz. You're going to do the top number, the numerator, divided by your denominator or your bottom number. So we would do 7 divided by 8. You're going to need to add a decimal and some zeros, and then you are going to go ahead and divide. And we get 875 thousandths. So this is how you change a fraction to a decimal. You then need to change that to a percent. So we already talked about changing a decimal to a percent. You move the decimal to the right 2 places, and this is going to equal 87 5/10%. I'll do one more for you, but they all work the same. You're going to do your numerator divided by your denominator, and then you are going to move that decimal to the right places. So here we would do 15 divided by 7. We're going to need to add some zeros. I think I'm gonna add one more zero. We are allowed to round to the nearest 10th. So it doesn't mean the nearest 10th here. It means once we move the decimal over 2 spots, we can round to the nearest 10th. So actually, yeah, I just need one more. Okay, so 7 goes into 60. Sometimes Mrs. Koenig blanks on her math facts. 7, let's see, it'd be 8, right? 56. Subtract, we get 4. All right, so now this is the decimal that this equals, but we're going to change it into a percent. So we're going to move that over to, and actually we're going to round here and say this is 214, and and we are going to look to see, are we going to keep that at 2 or bump it to a 3? We look to the right to tell. This is 5 or higher, which means that's going to bump to a 3. And we get 214 3/10%. I want you guys to try a few of these on page 284. I'd like you to do 20 to 35 by 5. So 20, 25, 30, 35. 4 problems. Come back for the homework review soon. See you guys then.